Hello, my name is David Stiers. I'm the Director of Learning and Leadership Programs at the League of American Orchestras. Thank you so much for joining us today for another one of our important webinars on how orchestras can respond to the current pandemic crisis. The past 2 Wednesdays, we've looked at how orchestras can benefit from recent federal relief packages and what decision-making considerations are necessary right now. Recordings of those 2 webinars are available on demand on the League's website. And this week and next, we'll turn to fundraising. And we know this is a stressful time for everyone. And again, we appreciate your taking the time to join us today. I do want to start by expressing our thanks to our generous funders for these webinars and making them possible, including American Express, the Howard Gilman Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as support in part by public funds from New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. Also, as a reminder, everyone who is attending and registered for today will receive an email with the recording of this webinar very soon, along with a survey, as well as the PowerPoint deck, which you received in advance with the reminder email. We had over 400 registrants for the webinar today, and so we're thrilled by the engagement of the field, and it now gives me great pleasure to introduce our presenters. We have Bob Swaney, who's the founder and CEO of Robert Swaney Consulting, and he has a 30-year career in arts fundraising and has worked with over 100 organizations across the country to strengthen their philanthropic core. He has served on the development staffs of the Chicago, Evansville, Indianapolis, and St. Louis Symphony Orchestras. And we are excited to announce that as of this week, Bob is the League's new Interim Vice President of Development. So a special welcome to Bob in joining our staff. And we also are pleased to have with us James Leffler, the Vice President of Development of the Dallas Symphony since 2016. He has broad experience in nonprofit development, having worked in a variety of areas, including youth services, higher education, healthcare, and performing arts. And additionally, James was a partner in a consulting firm that provided fundraising and digital solutions for community colleges. Again, please feel free to ask any questions by typing them in the Q&A box, but we'll have plenty of time at the end of Bob and James' presentation to take questions. And again, I want to thank Bob and James for being with us today. So I'll turn it over to the 2 of you.
Well, thanks so much. This is Bob, and thanks to the League. We really appreciate the opportunity to do this. We think it's a valuable service that you're offering to get this information out at a very critical time. You're doing good work, and now wearing many hats, I encourage everyone, especially to help support the League. So thank you as you're putting all this together, and thanks everyone for attending. I know that this is a very serious and critical time for you, lots of priorities. And so those are really, it's a really important time for you to think about fundraising, think about making some changes. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that with you today. As far as, next slide, please. And as far as our, for those of you who are not familiar with our firm, could you go to the next slide, please? There it is. I'll go quickly on this, but we're focused solely on fundraising for arts and culture. We worked with over 100 arts organizations in 80 markets now at this point. Most of what we deal with is performing arts, and of that, most are symphony orchestras. Happy to say that one of the symphonies that we've worked with for some time is the Dallas Symphony, and that's how my partner in crime today, James Leffler, came to agree to participate in this. He's got some very valuable firsthand information about how they've done and what they're working on. And so, James, I'll just hand it over to you for a second. You can introduce yourself and talk a little bit about our work.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to echo Bob's words of appreciation to everybody for your time today. We've been working with Bob and his firm for about 4 years now, focused on strategy on all parts of our contributed revenue with a particular emphasis on the annual fund. So that's included our approach to working with donors, our all of our back-end operations approach, and in-depth team coaching for each of our team members. In that time, we've seen significant growth in the annual fund that we're very happy with, largely due to Bob's guidance. And also something that perhaps doesn't get talked about as much, but that Bob's had a big hand in, is helping to decrease turnover on our team. We had a lot of turnover in our development department, sort of preceding Bob's involvement with our organization. And since that time, that has really slowed, and we've had a very solid team. And I'm sure I don't have to tell all of you why that's so important and how that's contributed to our success. Thank you, Bob.
All right, thanks very much, James. We'll go to the next slide. We'll talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today. And again, we've got an hour and a half. We want to leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So the three things that we'll focus mostly on are identifying and maximizing the fundraising opportunities that exist right now, and offer some baseline ideas for the summer months of fundraising, and then how to prepare for 2021 fundraising as well. We'll get more into the details of the 2021 fundraising next week as we talk about stewarding and working with donors. And as this begins to take shape about what's the summer look like, what's the fall look like, and how those things begin to blend, we have some ideas on that to share with you. So here's what I'll say before we go on. We've talked with a little over 30 arts organizations, most of them symphony orchestras, in the last 2.5, 3 weeks. And we did that for a couple of reasons. One is we wanted to offer help on the spot, pro bono as we could. Some of you were on those calls. And the other reason, of course, is we wanted to hear what you were doing and what your challenges were, what they are, how you were handling them, so that we could actually have this moment today to talk about best practices in this sort of environment. What I think you'll find is, though, we know that we've got group 1s on here. We know we've got group 7s on here. We've got things, so a broad spectrum of board level, staff level, musician involvement. So what we're going to do today is talk in more general terms about just theme, idea, feel, and approach. That's why we wanted to leave you with plenty of time at the end to do the initial Q&A. What I'll say, though, is if we cannot, and we hopefully won't get to all of the Q&A today, my contact information will be at the end of the presentation. And I promise you, if you send the questions to me, very specific questions to your organization, either James or I will respond to that so that we make sure that we get those addressed for you, okay? Terrific. Next slide, please. So unlike the last 2 weeks, today is focused on fundraising, not the CARES Act, not SBA loans, not PPP. Those are available online on demand, and you can listen to those again. We talked about, is this something we wanted to touch on? We figured this wasn't one of those touch on subjects at this point. This was a subject that if you go down the hole, you are deep in the hole. So we wanted to be sure that you utilize the resources that are on there. We're going to focus on the fundraising today. So looking at one of the first things is, there's a lot we don't know. And from the conversations that we had, our instincts as leaders and, organizational leaders, fundraising leaders, board leaders, our instincts are to try to get into all the things that we usually know and can control and can react to. There's a lot we don't know, and it's moving fast. So this idea, we don't know when the situation is going to end. We don't know when it's going to feel differently. We don't know when it's going to mend, or whatever that might look like. We don't know how our patrons are going to be impacted outside the scope of their patronage to our organizations. We don't know what permanent changes might result. It's hard right now to even fully understand what intermediate changes might result. So looking too far down the road is difficult, particularly with relationships and fundraising. And we don't know how many organizations won't survive in their present form, what the situation will look like with the partner industries that you all have to work with just to put music on the stage and out in the community. So what we're saying is, particularly with fundraising, don't spend a lot of time to focus on what you don't know and trying to address it. It's hard to address issues when you can't define the variables. And so we're going to take a look at the things today that we can control and that we can influence as we move through. All right, next slide, please. So some of the things that we do know. We know that patrons remain generous. Historically, we know this. We know that through all sorts of other national incidents and through history, some of the difficulties that we've had, that we bounce back and people remain generous and organizations remain generous. So looking at that, that's the first assumption that we take. We not only believe, but we also have seen, and I hope you each have experienced it as well, there's a growing hunger for access to arts and culture. Many of you have been thankfully putting out lots of performances, big and small, live and on demand, and those are increasing rapidly and seemingly being consumed rapidly. We also know that fundraising right now is the main, if not the only, source of revenue for some organizations. Some places are still having some earned revenue come in. Subscription campaigns for next year are still activated, and that money's coming in. But by and large, fundraising is taking center stage on this at this point. And we also know that confidence matters. The distinctive difference that I heard in the conversations I had with orchestras and opera companies and performing arts centers in the last few weeks is that confidence matters. It's the idea that if you're talking publicly about, we may have to shut down and we're looking at bankruptcy and really those sort of draconian moves, and you're making that public, it's really hard to inspire confidence and investment. And so to me, that was a marked difference in the things that I heard. So everyone, what I'll say is, first of all, looking at this, as odd as it sounds, don't freak out. It's not the first crisis we faced. We know that people remain generous. We know that you have enough other things to deal with where you have variables that you'll have to work with. Fundraising can be one of the cornerstones in activity for you. And who knows, philanthropy may jump through the roof. We don't know. We do know, as I said, people remain generous. We do know that in other times, this philanthropy has taken a dip, sometimes 7 to 10%. But it's always bounced back, and it bounces back very quickly in general terms. So that's why we say confidence matters. All right, next slide, please. So some other outcomes of what we teach and coach, and then this current situation, we're saying, not just keep the money, but do everything that you can to keep the money in the current fiscal year. So rather than, and we'll get into the details in a bit, but rather than having the money be put on account for a purchase later, and versus turning that into an annual fund gift and then selling a ticket to that same patron later when you're back on your feet as an organization and you know what your schedule is and the schedule is not going to be canceled and all those unknowns now become knowns, is actually a very good way to help this year and not hurt next year. So thoughtful yet urgent asking must continue. And when I use the word urgent, it's in a very positive way. To think about who can you appeal to right now. We know messaging should be upbeat and inspired. And many of you, again, have been doing that. Not universally, but I read quite a bit of this that comes through. And it is upbeat, and it is forward thinking, and it is inspired for you to continue to produce the art and to post it in places and produce it and advertise it in ways that people can take advantage of. So we say add value and a voice to that value frequently. We know that every orchestra right now is limited in the kind of art that it can produce, the kind of music it can put out into the community and the ways it can do it. But what you can do is do it at the highest quality that is available, and to voice that very frequently. And we'll get in a little bit more into how to engage that next week, about how to engage donors in that process as well. Okay, next slide, please. So we say focus on what we know and what we can control and influence. So there are too many, as I said a moment ago, there are too many unknowns to address. For some of you, they're changing daily. For some of you, they're changing hourly. And so our caution is, how much detail do you voice that in to your constituency base and to your patron base? If things are always changing for them while they change for you, it also can cause some real confusion for them. And we know that when patrons get confused, they stop buying and they stop giving. So we want to do what we can to avoid that. So stay away from the unknowns and trying to address those in ways that would later change and maybe perhaps cause some confusion. there are variables that you can control and variables that you can influence. And that's it, even on a normal fundraising day, we talk a lot about this with folks we work with. So this idea of what can you can control the frequency and the content of what you message and how you message. And so what do you talk about? How frequently do you talk about? Who do you talk about it with? Is there any way for it to be interactive? And so ideas like that. Another thing you can control is producing and promoting your music. And I know that different organizations are at different levels with their musicians. And so you may not have full control over that, but hopefully you do have some control over that. Engaging with your constituents. You get to decide how often you reach out to your patron base and your donor base. You get to decide what you say to them. You get to decide what kind of feedback you ask for. And so that's something that you can control. You can also control the strategies that you put forth as an institution and how those strategies line up with fundraising appeal and approach and strategy and tactics as well. When and how you ask for support is probably the single largest thing you can control when it comes to fundraising. Also, of course, stewarding those relationships and continuing to stay in contact with folks. The things you can influence that come to mind are what your constituents think about and what they're thinking about your organization and with what frequency and what kind of sentiments can you communicate to them that will resonate with them. What others say about your organization is something else that you can influence. You can't fully control, but you can actually influence it. The confidence that others have in your organization, and you can influence how engaged your board, staff, and musicians remain, other volunteers remain during this period. Again, you can't control all those issues, but you can certainly influence them by what you set up and how you stay nimble and out ahead of these things as best as possible. Okay, next slide, please. But that's great theory. So what are some things you can do right now? 6 action steps that you could take right now to help raise more money. Again, many of you are doing number 1, creating and posting content online. And if your organization cannot do that for budget reasons or technology reasons, look at being able to post other information. So the League does this, Opera America does this, where they've become a repository of other live and on-demand performances that are going on throughout the country. If your organization is not in a position to produce that on your own, there's plenty out there to connect with and continue to provide your constituency base with on-demand and maybe perhaps even some live art and music. So number 2 is we say constantly promote. My less eloquent way of saying this is stay in everybody's face. And I've said that over and over again to folks I've talked to. And again, many of you are doing a great job. I get from some of our clients 3 or 4 email blasts a week talking about what's being produced, what's being loaded, what's going to be available. I think that's terrific as well. We say double down on stewardship. This is a big one. It's really difficult right now when you are hunkered down making the kind of decisions that you have to make to not reach out on a regular, formalized, structured basis to your donors. This is one, and James, I might ask you just for a second to chime in on this one. Some of the things that your organization's done with stewardship, how you've reached out to donors, and maybe what one of the 2 of the responses have been like.
Yeah, sure. So echoing a lot of what Bob said, our mantra has been, the number 1 thing for us is to not go silent on our patrons and donors, and to make sure that we're in constant communication with them in a way that makes sense for them, of course. So that's phone calls, it's emails, it's the content that gets shared through our various channels. So we're also obviously using our board and our musicians and all of our staff beyond just the development department. I think it goes without saying that our CEO or the leader of your orchestra should be involved in these conversations. But we've also been engaging the leaders of our education department and our artistic planning department, connecting with donors, sharing information with them that they would want to hear. I'm sure you've seen and are doing a lot of really creative things out there. Just a couple that we're doing. We've just invited all of our board and all of our larger annual fund donors to some sort of a coffee, lunch, or cocktail chat with either myself or our CEO and a musician. We're seeing a lot of positive receptivity to that. And it's a way for people to, frankly, not only pass time when they're stuck at home in most cases, but also to have what feels like a more intimate interaction with a musician and for them to get to know one another. And what we've seen is we plan those for 30 to 45-minute segments, and they typically end up running an hour to an hour and a half, and in some cases 2 hours, because both sides, the musician and our donors, are so interested in having those opportunities and those conversations. The other thing I would say is something we've done that has really made a difference for us is we've continued to plan for the future, and we've continued to engage our board and our donors in those conversations and keeping them forward looking with us for things that we already had in the works that we want to keep moving forward to the best of our ability. So for instance, we're still moving forward with our nominating and governance cycle and are talking to prospective new board members. We're still making plans for our education programs in the fall that we've been building as part of a new strategic plan. We're still launching our Women in Classical Music seminar and talking to people about that. We've launched a new corporate event last December. We're in the process now of recruiting for that, even despite the challenging corporate environment, and we're seeing some positive response. So again, for us, it all goes back to not sitting on the sideline, but staying in the conversation to the extent that it makes sense for our donors, our board, and our patrons.
Great. Thank you, James. I've heard stories of organizations who have reached out to every single donor and every single ticket buyer, subscriber mostly, and had this conversation about what's next, what's the plan, checking in on them, doing that sort of care calling as well. It's and it really is paying dividends in terms of relationship right now, just to keep people connected and plugged in. The fourth one, of course, is ask for support. And some of you might chuckle, but I have to tell you, in some of the conversations I've had, I've heard some real reluctance to do even thoughtful, targeted approaches to ask for ongoing support during this time. On the opposite side, what I've heard is that those who do are finding very generous donors with nearly no pushback. It's not always the amount that they normally give. It's not always on the same terms in which they always give it, but those donors understand the predicament that everyone's in, and when they can, are very, very willing to help. So I've heard nothing but really good conversations resulting from asking for support. We've talked a lot about engaging musicians and board. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in detail next week when we talk about stewardship and how to keep donors and prospects engaged. We're looking at the last one is consider engaging a guide. That might be a consultant for fundraising, so it might be a company like mine, although I'm not suggesting that right here. But it also might be a board member. I can think of a couple of organizations we work with who have retired fundraising professionals who are on their board and can help through something really critical like this, a moment where some added guidance is needed, some added activity is needed. And so particularly if they're on your board and they come with that level of fundraising background, really work to engage them as your guide through this. Okay, next one, please. Okay, this one's more fun. So 6 action steps your orchestra should not take right now. And the first one is needs-based fundraising. The idea where we're saying, we need the money, please give us the money. It rarely flies well anyway, and particularly now. It's a terrible approach because everyone needs money, and it also puts us then in the same categories as health and human services, which are desperately needed. We can't win that sort of argument, that sort of approach. So we say do value-based, not needs-based. Requiring the board to fully fill the gap. So if you've identified an X percent or X number dollar that has to be filled, telling your board that because it's late in the fiscal year, it's up to them, is usually not a winning strategy. James mentioned number 3, but right, don't disappear. Don't go away and disappear as an organization. Continue to reach out, continue to put information out. Don't openly discuss bankruptcy or as I said, some draconian move for your institution, particularly so early in the game, where no one can possibly help you recover from that sort of a statement. I wouldn't consider philanthropy as an all-in or an all-out affair. What I mean by that is it requires some more flexibility, some flexibility in terms of your donors, of course, are going through situations. I'm sure you've experienced this, but they're going through situations right now too, in terms of their businesses, their retirement, whatever that might look like. And so if they can't be all in right now, that doesn't have to mean that they're all out. And don't rely too much on the government money and the loans for your organization's recovery, just again, because of all the unknowns that we can't even quantify or articulate at this point. And so we don't know where the finish line is. And so I say, you know, if you can get this and you've applied for it and you've got notification, it's fantastic. But it's probably the first thing that you're going to do, not the last thing you're going to do. Okay, next slide, please. So we talked about the message and frequency mattering, and I said don't get too much in details, particularly if they change. So in terms of messaging, what we've recommended is staying at 30,000 feet, staying in the place where few, if any, of the details are going to change. But so when you put out information, it's pretty solid and it's not going to change tomorrow or next week if you can help it. So we think about things about if you're producing music and putting it online on demand or live, those things aren't likely to change. You can keep talking about those, and you probably should actually. And if you're going to continue to have a fundraising campaign, of course, if you're looking at what your concert season and you're positive when you're going to start, which I doubt anybody is at this point, but when it comes to that moment, you can talk with specificity about that. Your commitment to the community is not going to change. Your value to the community might even become greater. Those are also things that you can identify and discuss at very high levels. So again, focusing on the activities that you're doing right now and focusing on value. So when it comes to looking forward, be vague. When it comes to looking at what you're doing right now, be specific and talk a lot about the value that it's adding to your audience base, your donors, and your community. If you must talk about a disappointment, what we're recommending is you couch it around two positives. And again, I know that might sound strange, but the idea that if it's just bad news, it's hard to build an ongoing case, and it's hard to build increased value over that bad news. Doesn't mean you shouldn't talk about your disappointments, but at the same time, there's plenty of good news to put out there if you're producing music and voicing it frequently. So I keep coming back to that because it's one that you're doing very well. I like the next one because we just say become peddlers of hope. We do know that this is going to be over. We don't know what it's going to look like when it's over, but what we do know is that people need art and music. And I don't mean that necessarily in the ethereal sense. Look at how much increased usage has happened since orchestras and other performing arts have begun putting things online. The free, and not even just performing arts, but including museums and looking at virtual tours of zoos. I mean, everyone's getting that on there, and it's being used very highly. So at very high levels. And so this idea that you can say, listen, here's what we're doing right now. We know we're going to be back on stage eventually. Here's what we're committed to. And to talk about being inspired and being inspirational at the same time. We do talk about over-communicate and make it interactive when you possibly can. What I'll say about so over-communicate is, continuing the frequency on which you're putting out the messaging. The interactivity, when possible, for what I have a hunch of, and I don't have anything to prove it, but only a hunch, is that these e-blasts going out over and over and over again, with just saying, here's something you can take advantage of. Here's what we're going to produce. Here's what you can go to on YouTube. Here's what you can come to on Facebook. That'll get kind of stale over time. So what we've been suggesting is if there's a way to take a quick survey or to suggest a quick vote, which piece would you like to hear next? We could give you this one or this one. And it really doesn't matter because you'll eventually put them both up anyway. But the idea of engaging your patrons, even in the most simplistic way, so that communication doesn't simply flow one way. Okay, next slide, please. James, this is for you.
Thanks, Bob. So before I carry us through the next several slides, I want to echo something Bob said at the beginning. I'm going to share a number of examples of things we've done at the Dallas Symphony, many of which have worked for us in the last several weeks. A few haven't. But I want to couch all of that with the acknowledgement that things that have worked for us, things that make sense in our market with our donors and patrons for our organization, may not make sense for all of you. Our hope is that we'll give you some examples of more than what to do, how to think about how you can approach some of the challenges facing you. And for us, this all goes back to confidence in talking with our donors, confidence in asking for their support during precarious times and uncertain times, and certainly not knowing how somebody is feeling and what challenges they might be facing on the other end of the line. So all of this is set up in a way to help build that confidence for you and your team, and also address some ways that if you do run into a challenging issue with somebody, you leave that situation with them feeling still very positive about the interaction and about your organization. Because of course, as much as we want to engage donors and our patron base in supporting us now, we also want to make sure they feel as good, if not better, about us coming out of this so that we can maintain our long-term relationships. So let's start with something that is historically purely transactional, ticket money. And Bob referenced this a little bit when he talked about keeping as many dollars in the current fiscal year as possible. So there's a number of different ways you can see on the slide that people can handle their tickets in any given time. And now that many of us have either canceled the rest of our season or much of the rest of our season, some of these are very relevant. What I want to encourage you to consider doing is first to look at it as a contribution and actually approach it like philanthropy in terms of asking your patrons to consider donating the tickets back. And whether you couch that as part of your annual fund or wherever that lands in your budget, we've seen a lot of really positive response to that. And part of the reason I'm encouraging you to lead with asking them to make it a donation back is because what we've discovered is for a lot of people, it didn't even necessarily occur to them, and they're happy for that to be the case. It allows them to contribute now and make a difference. And if you can message this properly across your entire patron base, it will actually have an impact on your budget if you're successful. In fact, we've seen over 80% of our subscribers agree to make it a straight donation to the organization, which has been great. And you can also leverage that in the future, depending on how things work for the way your annual fund is set up. If you credit that towards their annual fund, it could actually bump them to the next giving level in certain cases. And you may even be able to retain them at that giving level plus their tickets, especially if that comes with some additional benefits next season that they've been able to enjoy and experience. So I would encourage you to think about that globally if you can. It's not that we don't happily offer exchanges or refunds or putting the money back on a patron's account. We're of course more than happy to do that, but we start the conversation with the annual fund. So this last note on the slide about the advantage of canceling the remainder of the season, a couple of caveats. First of all, we're not advocating that if you haven't canceled yet that you do that. We recognize that this is part of a conversation that's much larger than just fundraising and the fundraising team. What we do want to say is if you have canceled your season or you think you're close to doing it, there is a certain advantage from a fundraising perspective to having done that, or if you're close to having to do that, there's an advantage that you can leverage to go ahead and moving forward with canceling all of the season rather than piecemealing. And part of that is the ability to go ahead and convert all unused tickets to donations. And it also allows you to immediately focus your communications on some of the content that Bob has been sharing, and also engaging your donors in potentially supporting the organization now and finding out what their concerns and needs are. So it's really more of an efficiency thing if you're in the position of already having to have done that or you're close to doing it. Next slide, please.
Actually, James, can I ask one question that came up specifically about this?
Sure.
If this is the heavy annual fund season, There's concern that asking for ticket donations for annual fund credit may give some donors confidence that they can give tickets in lieu of cash.
Sure, I think that's a really good point. So first of all, I'm not suggesting that makes sense for every organization or even every segment of your donor base. So it's just an idea to look at and see if it makes sense for you. The way we've been framing it, and I'll jump ahead just a little bit, 2.5 weeks ago, when we realized we were going to be canceling concerts for the rest of our season, we immediately put a letter together over our CEO's signature and sent it to all of our Stradivarius patrons. So those are our larger donors who give 3,000 up to 100,000 plus on an annual basis. So for us, that represents a little over 500 households. And we had multiple asks in that letter. It was, of course, to renew their annual fund support if they haven't. Whether they had or not, we asked them to consider an additional gift if they're in a position to do so. And we were very careful how we couched that language. And we also, as part of the letter and the follow-up, asked all of our donors, in addition to those two things, to consider donating their tickets back. And we were very intentional in making it an and conversation, not an or. And then to answer the question, if you decide that that makes sense for you to sort of count it towards the donor's annual fund for the year, I think part of what you need to do is when you talk to them for next season's contribution is just be upfront about, remind them what happened last year, and then have the conversation with them of what you hope they might consider for the new fiscal year. Does that answer the question, David?
Great, yes. And again, I think people also would like to hear a little bit more about keeping the money in the current fiscal year. Why is that important to emphasize?
Yeah, so I'll answer that, and Bob, jump into, and I think we're going to speak to some tactics, some techniques for doing that with the rest of the presentation. But for us, it's right now, it's more of a cash game than it is a balance the budget game. Don't get me wrong, it's not that we don't take that seriously, the point of trying to balance the budget, but I think for almost all orchestras, that's an unlikely reality at this point, and most funders and board members and donors are certainly going to understand that as long as we're doing everything we can to sustain the organization to the best of our ability, I don't think any of us are going to get dinged for whether we balance the budget. But what really does matter is our cash position. So especially with some of the new accounting standards where revenue has to match expense, to the extent that we can create the flexibility to keep cash in the current fiscal year and stay liquid and solvent, that's a very important feature of our total strategy. Bob, do you have anything to add?
I do. My answer is unfortunately or unfortunately based more on greed. And so what I'll say about that, the way that I looked at it was, at this time, getting conversion into from ticket purchase into the annual fund, it does two things. One, it does what James said. It helps strengthen the cash position. But the second thing is we have to believe that when performances come back, that a majority portion of those ticket buyers are going to come back and spend money with you again. So rather than put money on account or with a voucher or through some sort of exchange, which the exchange might end up getting into a canceled concert as well, which has, puts you on a repeat track of having to go back to those patrons. So from a cash now and a cash later position, plus an efficiency standpoint, plus building a more solid patron base into the annual fund, there's the urgency of keeping it now can commonly make sense to your ticket buyers.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Next slide, please. So a couple of things we've been thinking about. Bob said earlier, one thing to not do is ask your board to fill the gap. Of course, I agree with that. And at the same time, our board should represent our most committed group of donors and advocates. So we want to start the conversation there. And I'll share an example of something that we've done that actually was the idea of one of our most committed executive committee members, who's now our chair-elect. She came to our CEO and me a couple of weeks ago, and she said, I have an idea. I'd like to put together a group of about a dozen people to sign a letter that we can send to the board and our broader, more committed donors and ask them to do three things: to donate their tickets back for the rest of the season, to increase their current fiscal year annual fund commitment by at least 50% and pay it by the end of June. And it's important to note that our fiscal year ends May 31. And then the third thing is for them to go ahead and pledge next year's annual fund gift at their normal commitment level and pay it in August. So it was a great idea. She completely ran with it. She did all of the soliciting of our executive board members and a number of other very committed board members, and indeed surpassed her goal of 12 signers. So we then put this letter together, sent it out in email form so we could get it quickly as an individual email to the rest of our board and a group of about 40 other of our annual fund donors who give at a higher level, asking them to join this group of signers in making these three commitments. It's been wonderfully helpful to us. So for us, and we're looking at about we're looking at a $7.6 million annual fund goal this year. So this resulted so far, and we're still doing follow-up calls, in an additional $300,000 for us in annual fund pledges for this year, which the dollar amount is less relevant as we talk to a broad group of orchestras with a wide range of budget sizes. But for us, what that represents is almost 4% of our total annual fund goal in additional gifts from what ultimately is a very small group of donors. And perhaps more importantly, all of those are committed to paying their full annual fund gift with the increase by the end of June, helping our cash position. For next fiscal year, this effort resulted in more than $1 million in early annual fund commitments for us, the vast majority, not all of which, but the vast majority of which will be paid in August. So I will say Dallas is a very, relatively speaking, healthy economy right now compared to some other markets. So I recognize this exact approach may not work for everybody, but I think two key things really made a difference. We were fortunate that we had a very well-respected leader of our board step up and say, I'm going to make this happen. So even if somebody doesn't present themselves, if you can encourage and inspire someone on your board to lead an effort like this, whatever the ask or asks are, we were able to craft that letter in a way that was a little bit more direct than we might if it was coming from a staff voice or our CEO voice. And it was really a rallying cry, and we've seen a lot of positive response to that, and I imagine we'll continue to see some benefit from that. So I wanted to share that story with everybody of the way that we've approached working with our board to increase their support and help us during this time. Of course, we've had some people say, I just can't, for a variety of reasons, and we respect that, and we're grateful for everything they have done and hopefully will continue to do in the future. We've also, of course, worked really hard to make sure that we renew all of our board donors this year. I think that's part and parcel to doing everything we can to weather the storm. And then we can take all of this money that we've raised, the additional 300,000 plus, hopefully more, and leverage it as a collective challenge grant, of course. And I'm sure that's not a new conversation, but if anybody has questions about some ways you can do that, Bob and I would be happy to speak to that at the end of the conversation. Next slide, please. So a couple of different ways to think about your different donor groups. So at the Dallas Symphony, we've got our broad-based annual fund donors who give less than $3,000. We have our Stradivarius patrons who give $3,000 to over $100,000. And then of course we have our highest level donors who we always pay very close attention to. And whether it's a top 20 for you or a 5 or however you striate those, obviously we want to double down on our efforts to steward those people during these times. So each of these groups is getting a different mix of stewardship and asking. So I'll start with the broad base, even though this says premier donors, it's something I want to highlight. We have not stopped our telefund and direct mail efforts. In fact, we've seen those be more productive than usual, in part because people want to be part of helping support the orchestra during this time, but also, frankly, people are at home and more accessible via phone, so we're having higher contact rates, and that's resulting in more gifts. So I would encourage you to continue those efforts if you can.
And James,
Yes.
just one quick thing on that too, because we realize with a group one orchestra, group two orchestras, you can do that. When we start getting down below, not everyone's engaging a telefunding type company, but some of the great stories I've heard have been even from homes. People, board members, even some musicians are making those calls with very little information, very little structure, just the idea of here are the unrenewed donors, here are some lapsed donors. We'd like you to try to get them back, and here are a handful of really positive talking points. And it's work. It takes almost no, because you're not putting a room together. It takes almost no organization, except for the names and except for the methodology of how to get information back from those people when someone says yes. But I've seen it be really quite effective even for smaller organizations right now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point, Bob. So for us, our Stradivarius patrons, that 3,000 plus group, I mentioned a few minutes ago that we immediately sent a letter over our CEO's signature, and it was a little different tone than we might normally take. We wanted to acknowledge the reality of the circumstances, the uncertainty and the challenges that we face, but to everything Bob's been saying at the same time, we want to be positive and confident about the future, and we took that tone. And we very directly asked patrons our donors, if they had not renewed, to go ahead and renew their commitment now. And if they're in a position to do so, consider an increase. And we did use language like that signals we understand you may not be, but still making the ask. And if they hadn't renewed, or they had renewed their support already, we sent them that letter and just asked for them to consider an increase. We waited for those to drop, and then a couple of days later, we immediately sent individual scans of those letters via email to basically the entire list from their fundraiser. And again, I acknowledge not all orchestras have this sort of capacity or size, but I think you can learn from some of these techniques, regardless of your size and capacity. And we sent it for a couple of reasons as an attachment. We wanted to make sure, we've heard from a number of sources that some people are sitting on their mail for a while, or at least at that time were, because they didn't want to touch it for risk of contracting COVID-19. And also just in case somebody missed it or didn't see it, or they want to respond quickly. And we framed the email from the fundraiser in a way that says, just wanted to make sure that you saw that this was sent to you and that you had it electronically. If you have any questions about this or about donating your tickets or next season, or just about the orchestra's response, here's my contact information. And I'll be calling you in a day or two to follow up. And for us, we're still working on some subscription renewals. So that was a way for us to sort of frame this is why we're calling you. And of the more than 500 households we sent this letter to, we received so far exactly one unhappy response, which I will say is not uncharacteristic of that individual. I ended up calling and speaking with them, and we had a great 45-minute conversation anyway. And other than that, almost all of our normal annual fund donors are renewing, so they're responding positively. There's very few cases where they can't, and if they can't, they're very apologetic. And quite a few people are stepping up with some significant increases. So again, the moral of the story here is not necessarily that exact approach will work for your orchestra, but just to encourage all of us to stay confident in talking to our donors about how they can help us if they're in a position to do so. And then for our very highest level donors, again, whether you striate that by a group of one person, 5, or maybe you have 50 people that you count in that level, a couple of things that we did and I'm very fortunate at the Dallas Symphony, our CEO, Kim Noltemy, is an active and enthusiastic fundraiser. So she immediately started engaging our highest level donors on the phone daily and continues to do so. She keeps them looped in. If they're not on our board, she keeps them looped in with board update emails so they know what we're doing to respond to the challenges that we face. They know we have a plan. And we are, of course, directly asking for their support in very customized ways to help with this organization, with this challenging time. We're also keeping all of them updated as things evolve and change via email and direct communications from our CEO. And then we're very specific with them about our needs and strategies and finding out how they would like to be part of that. They don't all have the same vision for how they want to make a difference. So we'll talk in a moment. In fact, let's go ahead to the next slide, please.
Although I have two questions that may apply to this.
Oh, sure.
Before we move on. One is, if an orchestra was leaning towards doing an email appeal letter for the safety reasons, would you recommend doing postal instead or doing both?
For us at the time, it worked to do postal because our staff was still in the office. So that was easy to get done for us. I don't think that postal is necessary, with one exception. We know we've got a group of donors who do not use email. So it just so happens I come into the office one day a week, one afternoon, just to process mail that needs to be sent out to people where some electronic form of communication doesn't work. So I would say in response to that question, I don't think direct mail is important, except for any donors with whom you know that communicating via US mail is the best way to reach them.
Great. And one other question is, when you're asking for support, have you seen a difference in response from major donors versus small donors?
I think that's an interesting question. And Bob, I'd love for you to weigh in on this too. I would generally say no. And so what I mean by that is, obviously the dollar amounts are different, but we're seeing our most capable donors, some of them are impacted by this, just like some of our broad-based donors are financially and their own confidence. So we've only had one donor of a significant level just not renew their support at all. And they're in both oil and hospitality. So, it's understandably a very challenging time for them. But we're seeing very similar reactions. People, if they're able, they're stepping up and enthusiastically responding with additional support. Most people at minimum understand the need to continue their usual support if they're able, and they are, regardless of their giving level. And I think we're also anecdotally seeing across all levels, all giving levels, people are enthusiastically consuming the content that we're putting out, a lot of what Bob talked about at the beginning. Which brings me to one other note I'd like to share. We just happen to use MyEmma as our email communication. And one thing we did recently was go back through all of our donors, all of our Stradivarius patron donors, and look for the list of those who had opted out, which they of course can do on their own. And our fundraisers have been sending personalized emails and calling them directly to say, hey, we understand you've opted out. During this period of time, we're sharing content in a different way and also sharing updates in a different way. If maybe you would be interested in receiving that in the interim period, here's how you can opt back in. So it's a way for us to make sure everybody is getting the information if they want without sort of being intrusive. Does that answer the question, David?
Yeah, thank you.
Certainly. So let's go to the next slide, please. Yes, options for heroic and campaign donors. And this ties back into the top group of donors that we discussed on your last slide, however you striate that. As we're talking with donors, they all have different priorities and or different ways of providing for similar priorities for the organization. And this is where I think flexibility really matters in terms of how we accommodate their desire, how they want to give to the extent that we possibly can. So it's made for some very creative conversations, but a couple of examples for how we can help a donor make a difference right now could be, so let's say somebody's made a multi-year campaign commitment or just a large multi-year commitment that's not for operating support. One of the techniques you can use is to talk to the donor and just simply ask them to, for your current fiscal year and or the next fiscal year, consider unrestricting the use of that or redesignating it for operating purposes. Perhaps they were working on funding endowment of a new music fund and they don't want to see that go away. Another way you can approach the conversation with them is to ask them to consider us in effect adding a year of payments on the back end and converting the current payment due to help with this fiscal year's operating budget or next fiscal year or both. So there's a number of different ways you can approach that. We had a donor who has a private family foundation approach us recently. They have a fund in our endowment that is restricted, and they came to us and said, if you'd like, we can both unrestrict the funds and we'd also give you permission to spend down the corpus of it if you need, which created for an interesting conversation with that donor. So those are just a few examples of how, as you're talking to donors at the highest level, or if you're in the middle of campaign pledge payments being paid, how you can approach some of those conversations and potentially convert those to help with your current operational needs. And there are a lot of other scenarios, obviously countless. So if there are other questions, I'd love to speak more to those or have Bob speak more to those during the Q&A.
I do have one specific question since we're on campaigns. We had been planning a $5 to $7 million capital and endowment campaign this year. What are your thoughts about proceeding with such a campaign during these uncertain times?
So is it, and say again, it's an endowment campaign?
Capital and endowment.
Capital endowment. Well, if it's capital and if it has a capital component and there are expenses that are already in the queue, that sort of puts some pressure on you to continue. In terms of where you are in just a normal endowment campaign, I would say looking at how far along you are, not just in terms of reaching goal, but how deeply you are into the prospect base. What you could, it would be part of the consideration. What you could do on it, I suppose, is if you still have enough prospects available, you could do a hybrid ask where you're asking someone to both consider the campaign and then also consider a cash gift right now in terms of a growth gift to the annual fund or a special operating gift. And if you're able, this is where the flexibility comes in that James was talking about. If you're able then to delay the payments on the endowment or capital gift so that you can yield a larger gift from that patron, if he or she believes, or the institution giving to you believes that if another 8 or 10 or 12 months go by, they could actually do more, you could still record that pledge right now, put a little cash forward for the immediate situation, and show the potential donor great flexibility, which is one of the things they just require right now.
Great, thanks.
Let's go to the next slide, please. So we hit on a little bit of this earlier, but I do want to reemphasize, if you're using an outside vendor for telephone services or direct mail, and their call center or fulfillment center is able to still operate, which we realize is not the case across the country, I very much encourage you to keep them calling. The nice thing about Telefund is the moment you realize it's not effective or it's having a counterproductive result, you can shut it down almost immediately. So there's no risk in keeping it moving forward. And I will say we've had some of our best Telefund calling nights all season in the last couple of weeks, which has been great. What I'm about to suggest, I assume is not new for most of us, but one thing that we've done to great effect, and Bob referenced this earlier, is once we get a commitment in through Telefund, we create call sheets and we send those out to our musicians who are sitting home just looking for something to do. They've been happy to call. Of course, we craft a script for them, ask them to let us know if they hear about any issues and to give us just a real quick report on each conversation. And we've had feedback on a lot of great conversations. I also want to note we're still seeing add-ons to our subscription renewal campaign, whether that's through the form that people return or through an online subscription renewal. So if you're not making that available to people through their renewal, I would encourage you to do so. That's an important segment for us, and I imagine as well for many of you out there. And then Bob referenced this earlier, but I want to revisit it. We've very much moved away from benefits-driven asks. So our Stradivarius patron donors have for years now been purely a philanthropic message, and the benefits they receive is, in almost all cases, sort of an afterthought and a thank you rather than the case for why we would like them to give. But we have still been very much more benefits driven in terms of how we approach our broad base, because for a lot of them, we're still trying to make their symphony experience stickier in their lives and a more consistent part of what they do on a month-to-month basis. And so we're trying to enhance that. Well, obviously not being in concerts for the foreseeable future, it's hard to deliver on those benefits. So we've really changed that messaging to focus on what we're doing at the Dallas Symphony with having moved a lot of our music education programs online, which I realize, again, may not apply to all of you, but finding something like that that is on the philanthropic messaging side. And we've also been using our musicians, whether it's quotes or writing letters or being part of videos, to talk about why having the orchestra ready and in a position to get back to performing as soon as we can is so meaningful, not just to them, but to the community and the people they are hearing from. And that's really strengthened our message. Next slide, please. So I think Bob's going to take this one.
So for sponsorships, and again, I understand that different organizations do this differently, and it's not all based on budget size, it's based on community and approach too. But so some sponsors are individual sponsors, sometimes they're called underwriters, and then there are institutional sponsors that can be anything from a family foundation to a very large corporation or a set of small businesses that pool together. But in any regard, you know, we have the same approach. We as best we can, we want to try to keep the money in the current fiscal year. And the response is always, we can't do that. We cancel the concert and you can't keep that money. Well, we think you can, and particularly if it's a concert or an education program, that there are some, and I'll highlight one of those ways in just a moment. Deciding when to move it into next season. To me, the single largest factor about deciding to move that sponsorship money, two really. One is what's the sponsor's wishes. We always have to go by that and want to go by that. Second is the idea that if you are postponing rather than canceling a concert, postponing, that means you can move everything together as a package. Your ticket buyers, your sponsors, along with the repertoire and any guest artists, everything moves as a package. So that's one plus for moving it into next season. The main reason, I'll back up now, the main reason to think about keeping it in the current fiscal year, and one way that we've advised that's been very successful, is to encourage the different usage of the sponsorship for the current year. And since most orchestras are coming up on the end of their fiscal year within the next few weeks to few months, depending on who you are, the idea of allowing that sponsorship or a portion of it to be used as a challenge grant to engender additional giving or fiscal year-end giving, or so as some sort of a challenge, then even if it's the money's already accounted for, you can say that this organization is, that the sponsor has challenged us to raise the same amount of money that they're allowing us to use this year. So make it legitimate, obviously. But the idea then that you can give them lots of recognition, lots of kudos. The other thing that you can potentially do, again, depending on your size and scope, if you're posting on-demand videos onto YouTube or onto your own website, you can give sponsorship credit for those. The other thing that I would say is, and I've seen this less than I would like, but in those moments when you do cancel a concert, I would still utilize that as a means to recognize the sponsor when you send it out. I've seen some of that, but I haven't seen a lot of that. But the idea then is, even if they're switching to something else like a challenge grant, or even if they're going to underwrite, be recognized on one of your on-demand videos or any kind of music that you're putting out there. It's okay to overemphasize recognition at this point. We do say always make direct contact with sponsors. Sponsors are people. It doesn't matter if they're individuals or institutional. We want to reach out, treat them with the same courtesy and respect and flexibility that we do with all the other donors. And that we want to be able to give a cooperative problem-solving approach to them, because frankly, they're dealing with things too, and you all well know this, but the idea of they might need options. They'll be, in some cases, desperate to continue to help the organization, but they can't do it under the promises that were made. And so we say approach this with thoughtfulness and flexibility, and with some cooperative options that you can provide to them. Okay, next slide, please.
So I'm going to move through the next 3 slides relatively quickly so we can leave as much time as possible for questions and answers. The one thing I would say about grantors is, just like our individual donors, let's not go away. We need to stay in touch with them, talk to them, keeping in mind in many cases, there's still an individual behind the decision making. So we need to maintain those relationships, have open communication with them about what our needs and challenges are. In a lot of cases, if you have gift restrictions from a grantor, we've seen a lot of them are voluntarily lifting those restrictions. They see and understand the need for that. If they haven't, it certainly doesn't hurt to ask if they would consider doing that or what that could look like. And again, being flexible and working with them. The one thing I would note is, again, being careful on the accounting standards to making sure if you move an event to a next fiscal year and they're still supporting that, but you want to bring the revenue into the current fiscal year, you may have some things to work through there. But getting flexibility from grantors through conversations and keeping them updated and sharing content about what the orchestra is doing will continue to be important. Next slide, please. Just some quick reminders. There are a lot of things we can do to make it easy for anybody to make a contribution. So be creative about where you can put a Give Now button. I obviously don't suggest that you put that on every piece of content you put out, but on occasion that certainly makes sense. Make sure it's prominent with the right messaging on the front of your website. I talked about subscription renewal channels earlier. And of course, phone call, email, leveraging your board, leveraging your musicians to stay in touch with donors can certainly make sense if you equip them properly. Next slide, please. So options for events. Many of us have fundraising events scheduled in the spring. You may even have your large gala or your largest fundraising event of the year. I know this was discussed on a lead call a couple of weeks ago, so I won't lean into this too much. But again, the one thing I would really encourage is talk to all of the participants, anybody who purchased a ticket, made a sponsorship, made a donation. I think people by and large are seeing they're happy to follow the orchestra's lead on whatever the next step is, whether you're converting it to an online event or you're going to postpone it or you're canceling it altogether. Options include just donating their money straight to the organization. Also, don't be afraid in some cases if you're rescheduling for next fall. Some people may consider donating their table or sponsorship now and re-upping in the fall. So it's a tool you can have in your belt as you're having these conversations. Next slide, please. Oh, yes.
James, one thing. I think a little bit earlier, you talked about reassigning event gifts. And again, could you give a little bit more explanation of that?
Yeah, so really what we mean by that is just whether you're canceling the event altogether or you're moving it into the next fiscal year, talking to whoever the participant or donor is and asking them if they would allow you to use that gift for this year for general operating support, or if the event was raising money for a specific initiative and that was in effect restricted, would they consider lifting that restrictive if the initiative no longer has that same need or timely need?
I think that was listed on the board slide as well. And so one of the things that we were suggesting is if an event's canceled, this is one of the additional ways that a board member could actually just easily help. They've already made the purchase, they've already spent the money. And so to ask them to convert that to an additional one-time special fundraising gift is fairly painless in that regard. So on to
Great,
summer
thank you.
plans. So we looked at two, and we've talked to organizations, two different things: a single performance in the summer, 4th of July, something like that, versus a series of performances that might last the entire summer. For a single performance that won't be rescheduled because it's unique and one of a kind, we say try to practice the same thing that you do as you're canceling winter series concerts, and that would be to approach the patrons to make a one-time annual fund gift. So that's one way to do it, of course. The only place where these summer plans really get difficult is if you don't have name capture on on the purchases. And in that event, you have to send out sort of a general, along with the cancellation, a general request that here are the options, and one of those, and the one that many patrons are taking advantage of, is to allow us to use that to the annual fund so that we can continue our operations and prepare for putting music back on stage. So that versus a series performance, where a series of summer performances, you have a little bit more flexibility. If you're not canceling the summer series but only postponing it, you have the ability in some cases to move people into later performances. If the whole summer series is off the table, obviously you can talk about moving some of those into the winter series, moving those into another special event if you have it around the holiday period, if you can add a performance. So again, I know you can't answer all those questions right now because we don't know when music's coming back, and we don't know when the live performances rather are going to be coming back. So one of the things that we'll talk about, I think in fact next, I'll just go to the next slide to kind of top this off. Because there's so much uncertainty, what we're encouraging right now is for organizations to create 3 different organizational plans, operational plans, if you will. One that would start the series on your winter series on time, one that would start it maybe around the holiday period, and then a third that would be a date of your choosing, but in all likelihood February or March of 2021. And they would be self-contained plans, but they'd be complementary. What it saves you the opportunity, what it saves you the headache of having to do is start with a blank piece of paper every time that you are thinking about what's down the road for the organization. The other part that it does, though, it helps drive not only operational activities, but each one of those 3 plans will have certain benchmarks for marketing and fundraising as well. So to have complementary revenue plans that go with each of those 3 launch points for the operational organizational plans will help fundraising work much, much better going into 2021. We're going to spend more time on this next week, so I'll leave this right here for now. But we've got an outline for how to accomplish that when we talk again next week. And look at the little curtain. Okay, so we'll do a wrap up and question Q&A, and then we have couple of follow-ups thereafter.
Great. So the first question is, we had planned to launch the silent phase of a capital campaign this summer and public in mid-fall. What are your thoughts on timing given the current situation? I'm going to assume capital means that it's some sort of building project or the hopes of a building project. To me right now, they're pretty uncertain. Here's what I would say you have to think about more. If in fact we can't really determine when live music's coming back to the stage, our only revenue stream, our only major revenue stream, is going to continue to be fundraising. And that's annual fundraising for operational support, hopefully small ensembles doing education-based, community-based performances. If it loosens up out there and we're actually able to do some things rather than no things. So that idea of can we get it back out, get the music back out there to some degree,
you'll need operational money. So my advice at this point, unless there are other details of the circumstances, I would say you have to take care of the operational needs first and foremost right now, and continue to message about a campaign, but talk about how you're going to do it in a responsible way, and with responsible timing, so that we're not overburdening anyone, we're not overreaching, we're not creating too much organizational or community risk. James, do you have a different thought on that?
I don't. It's hard to give a great answer without a lot more detail. The one thing I would say is if you have an individual or a group that is really enthusiastic about supporting it, not just about the idea, but about supporting it, and you think you can get a long way into the campaign and get some time under your belt in the campaign and still have momentum going forward from that group, that would make me more confident about entering something like that. But I would definitely proceed with caution right here, right now. Just so many funders, individuals and institutions are also feeling the market drop, and on top of that, doing everything they can now to step up for organizations. So I think the appetite for new projects is going to be somewhat suppressed. The only other thing I'd say is if you do enter a formal campaign of some kind and you decide that makes sense, I would absolutely try to find a way to incorporate operational support as part of the campaign so that you can leverage we're rebuilding or building anew for the future coming out of the crisis.
Yeah, I think you're right. Would you agree too, though, with the part of the question that's about a public phase? I would put a public phase on hold.
Yeah, I do agree with that. If for no other reason, it really could look,
The optics.
the optics, it'll make you look blind potentially to what's happening in the world around you.
Great. Next question on heroic giving. Any pros or cons to framing a heroic giving ask as a savings account type of gift that can be used without specific restriction, but sits outside annual fund contribution?
I think I understand, and my response will be sure. I mean, it's the money can be put in operational, or it can be put in board designated, or can be. I mean, you could, as an orchestra, you can create as many safety valves on it as you or the governance body wants to, but at the same time, you can, if you decided to put it in operational or not, doesn't really matter. You can decide to give, very specific recognition for that gift if someone's really, wed to the education or community programs or something very specific, or, the harp, I don't know, whatever that might look like. Then you can adapt recognition in terms of making the donor feel good and satisfied, but it doesn't have to be a restricted gift in that regard. So I think you have flexibility on both sides if you approach it that way.
Great. So here's a different question. With many musicians hurting financially, we have been looking at creating a special emergency fund to provide assistance. However, there is concern about whether contributions made to a special emergency campaign will have a negative impact on potential contributions towards the general operating or annual fund campaign, particularly as a smaller budget orchestra without significant safety net reserves. Any thoughts?
I'd love to speak to that a little bit. First of all, I think you can never go wrong by, quote unquote, doing the right thing when it comes to other people. So I think there's a lot to be said for finding a way to make something like that work. And we've seen cases here at the Dallas Symphony where when we've done something like that, that could potentially be seen as competing with the operational needs of the organization for dollars, we've actually seen that raise both ships. So we're able to effectively fund this sort of outside but related need, and it also creates more goodwill and more giving for our organization. So what I would recommend is consider pursuing the conversation, because I think it's going to create a great deal of goodwill among both your musicians and your donors and patrons, but do so in a way that's very intentional. So you speak with those donors about both needs and try to find a way that they can help support both at the same time. just be upfront with the conversation. What do you think, Bob?
I like your last sentence the best. Be really upfront about the conversation. Frame your conversation before you go out the door to talk about it. This is not, you do not want that kind of conversation to change. This has to be a constant. So the idea that we're taking care of musicians in and of itself, in my opinion, is not enough. We have to take care of them, if that's the phrase, and that's often the phrase used, for a purpose, and that purpose is to help continue to produce the music and to make sure that they are gainfully employed to help fulfill the mission of the organization to the best possible ability that we all have right now. So I'm always big on putting the mirror outward and having the cause and effect, the effect is on the community. And that could be the community at large. It could be our audiences. It could be schools. It could be whatever you frame that. So I would make sure that is a very well thought out presentation. Musicians, by and large, are always beloved at their orchestras, but putting purpose to helping support them right now will give you the added leverage that you need when going out and talking to folks about it.
Great. Another slightly new topic, but related, is for those who are familiar with Giving Tuesday, being the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. There's a new initiative by the same group, Giving Tuesday Now on May 5th. So what are your thoughts on joining this National Giving Tuesday Now Day on May 5th?
James, would you like to take this one?
Sure. For us, it's an easy yes. We're already planning to do so. Our local community, the North Texas Community Foundation, is supporting this, and we're just wrapping it in the message of our end of fiscal year campaign that we would normally be doing anyway. So for us, it's mechanically just an issue of creating a few additional assets, including their microsite for us and messaging, sharing our messaging with them to promote out. It's sort of like them fundraising on our behalf. We see it as a win-win.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'll give you the counterpoint to it, and that is, if provided that you have the resources to pull it off and not have it, if it starts frittering away the time that you have to go out and steward and talk with major donors and maybe do some of these other things we talked about, it's a fairly low return activity comparatively. But if you can do it, and if you're committed to do it, this is a great place to take some of those sponsors that we talked about a few minutes ago and have them flip into a challenge grant and be able to broadcast over and over and over again how generous that sponsor is for allowing this to happen. So there's really, if you do it, there's some potential leverage and upside to it as well.
Great. And speaking of sponsors, do you have suggested language for sponsorship agreements going forward that can clarify how dollars will be applied if concerts are canceled due to unforeseen circumstances, whether a quarantine or a hurricane? This person is thinking that they need to revise so that everyone agrees what happens. We keep it or it gets applied to next season before the crisis occurs.
This is Bob. A, it's a good idea. B, you'll never, if you try to think of every contingency like that, and I know we're talking about something limited now, but those things have a way of getting out of control over the years. It might be something more general that you put in that says, in the event that the performance is canceled for any reason, we agree to negotiate in good faith for replacement performance or activity. I mean, it could be something as simple as that. And I have not written such language yet, if that was the question. And I don't know if James has either.
No, I think it is an interesting question that had not occurred to me or my colleagues here at the Dallas Symphony. And at the same time, I agree with Bob. I think that can become a slippery slope. I'll just share anecdotally here for our corporate partners on the concerts we had to cancel. those were relatively easy conversations, and we were fortunate in all cases. They said, keep the money and we'll just re-up for next season and start anew. And they had little to no expectation of how we might recognize them. Now, none of those were substantial sponsorships, and that may be different. So, maybe if someone's, headlining a gala or something as your lead sponsor and writing a very significant check for that, maybe that makes more sense.
Okay. Another question. Are there any specific recommendations, such as benchmarking formulas, specific percentage decreases for individual or corporate giving, et cetera, to use while creating various budgeting scenarios for next season? Maybe the 08-09 season may be the closest to the current situation, but it's not really the same. So do you have any recommendations on how to do that scenario budgeting?
I can tell you what I've seen. James has much more firsthand experience of this. What I've seen is a best case, worst case, and likely that is accompanying these three operational plans that I talked about. The ones that have different start points in the season. Even those won't be lock solid. I think, and again, we'll talk a little bit about this next week, but the places that help improve the fundraising side of your income budget will be front-loading activities, particularly with those, your best donors, your board members, your top sponsors, getting that work done early and getting it done well, so that if things get out of control again, you have those locked in, you have those key relationships locked in, they're in with you and in for the ride, as it were. And the other money that you potentially would be leaving on the table because situations of changing that we can't control would be the lower dollar level, lower leverage level.
Yeah, I'll say for us, obviously the only thing that we know for sure is that whatever model we come up with will be inaccurate. It won't play out that way. On the optimistic side, if we can go back to concerts this summer, that's a fairly manageable reality that we can face, and we're approaching that with a reasonable amount of confidence. Again, recognizing Dallas has not faced the same challenges as some other markets. If we get into the fall in a worst case scenario and we're still not back into concerts, I think the negative impact starts to compound. But for us, I've thought less about specific modeling and metrics, and I've thought much more about how our fundraising team is reporting back in that they hear from each of their donors that they're talking to, especially our major annual fund donors, that group of 500 plus households, which is another reason I think it's so important to be talking to donors and funders. Is you'll get a very strong sense for where they at and where they're currently and where they think they will be in terms of their own confidence and their own philanthropy. And I think you can use that as the basis for your various models for what may or may not happen.
And one more question. From what you're saying, are orchestras looking at new or expanded ways to monetize their digital content distribution the coming year? Are you seeing anyone having success with donor support for online programs in lieu of live concerts?
My experience, this is Bob, my experience has been it's too early to tell yet. We're certainly suggesting it. We believe it can be monetized in terms of philanthropy. Doing a pay-to-view sort of situation is much more complicated, I think, and probably doesn't have the desired effect. So we're encouraging the underwriting of sponsorships on it, and utilizing even individual gifts and recognizing people. But it's a little too early to tell what the results of that sort of approach might be.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I go back to sort of what Bob said at the front. This is a fundraising conversation. I certainly applaud every effort to learn from this and to innovate and to find new contributed revenue streams. But yeah, I would view that as, new streams of earned revenue. And I would view this question as an earned revenue conversation. As we talk to our donors, presumably we will come out of this and can start to go back to normal
Well, thank you both. It's now sort of the bottom of the hour, and we want to be mindful of people's time. I'm sorry if your question wasn't able to be asked, but as Bob graciously offered, please feel free to email him directly. Today is part one, so I would encourage you to join us in 2 weeks when we'll be doing part two, particularly looking at donor relationships and appreciation of donors. And please check out the League's website for additional information. And also, I wanted Bob to be able to share a special offer that RSC is offering.
Oh, great, thank you. So some of you earlier, you took advantage earlier of when we did the 1 hour free coaching online. What we're trying to do is continue to give some good fundraising advice at a limited rate, so that understanding that things move very quickly, understanding that things change very quickly. And so what we've put together, and this is brand new for us, but a 3-month program that's all online, very similar to what we're doing here right now. It's one-on-one coaching, your organization and one of our consultants, 8 hours a month, and you can break that up however you would like to, both scheduled and then on-demand web meetings and phone calls. The offer that we're doing, it's $2,000 a month. And so if you put two months up initially, the third month is free. We also understand that in this time, there's a lot of risk in spending any money that's unbudgeted. So we're just going to offer a money-back guarantee on it. If you get to the end of the third month and you don't at least raise your $4,000 back, we'll give you a refund. And again, it's our way of trying to help the industry and monetize things a little bit, but we really do want to continue to be able to help in a meaningful way. So thank you for that, David.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Again, thank you, James. Again, if you haven't found all the resources on our website, please look at our coronavirus page where we have lots of resources, particularly around the federal assistance programs, as well as a new legal assistance program that the League launched last week, where Prior Cashman, expert attorneys in labor and employment law, are offering 1 hour of consultations for only $100, being subsidized by the League. So if you need expert legal advice, please take advantage of that. We hope all of you have registered for our free online national conference at leagueconference.org. We are looking forward to announcing that programming in the next 2 weeks and beginning the conference the first week of May, and hope that we will see all of you there. And we also, again, look forward to hopefully seeing you all next Wednesday for our second part of this webinar. And also feel free to look at the on-demand recordings that we mentioned of the past 2 Wednesdays on our federal relief. Again, thank you so much, Bob. Thank you so much, James. Thank you all for what you're doing to support your orchestras and your local communities. And please let the League know if we can be of any assistance. Have a great rest of the week.